Chapter 141 Cabin in the Woods. All right, let's stop here for the night, I announced, making the caravan grind to a halt. The clearing we were in wasn't large, but it was enough to hold all of us comfortably for the night. We were in for another large stretch of woods coming up, and this was the last clearing for a while where we wouldn't have to chop down bushes or plants to make camp. While annoying to do so, sometimes it was necessary. Plus, there was another reason we stopped here for the night. The dungeon wasn't far away now, and we would make it either early or mid-morning tomorrow, but it was still too far if we pushed through now. Everyone began the practice task of setting up camp, and I saw Vinny break out his hammer and tools. He would be in for a busy night repairing people's gear. I should help him if I find the time, I thought. It had been a few days since we had the chance to set up like this, and people's gear was in need of servicing. We had made our way through the low mana area and were fast approaching one of the hotspots on the map. Coincidentally, right where the dungeon resided. As the mana rose, the levels of the things inside of it did as well. Beasts above level 50 started to appear and were becoming increasingly common. Austin and Hal did a good job of keeping us secure, but I had us take a different approach to the rising difficulty. The scarcity of the beasts was a boon rather than a hindrance in that we could have a controlled atmosphere for some of the lower-level people in our caravan. The beasts didn't carry the same advantages to those of us above E rank, but were a massive boost to those below it. They made for perfect training dummies while we were still in the area for it. As we reached more difficult areas, we wouldn't be able to keep control of the situation and make sure nothing unexpected happened, which made it important to utilize it now when we could. Where we were now was perfect to get some of the lower-level people some experience to level up. Plus, we now had over 8 E-rank people to make sure nothing went wrong. Both Hal and Rachel evolved after our return, joining the rest of us. Rachel waited for her bloodline, which she bought right before the tutorial ended, and Hal delayed for a different reason. He wanted to use the last wave to squeeze out a few more upgrades. Plus, he wanted to see what he could get as a prize that would help him during his evolution. His bloodline wasn't as fancy as Rachel's draconic one, but it had a weight of its own. He chose the Razorbeak Griffin as his bloodline, and it was similar to Austin's in that it was a bird of prey bloodline. It boosted his perception and agility while it also boosted his wind affinity. He could enhance his arrows with razor-sharp winds that dealt devastating damage and rotated them around for an increased effect when they hit. He and my mom trained together using the winds similar to Gabriel and I. It was a running joke that we had 2 birds out on patrol, and the amount of times 2 birds 1 stone was mentioned sharply rose. Both men hated that joke already. While Hal could supervise the fights easily, he was on scouting duty and Jonathan was the one in charge of that effort. He was the best suited for it as his spiritual anchor was heavily tied to protection and his defensive skills were perfect for the task. As their group broke off to find their targets nearby for them to fight, Austin and Hal came up to me. They both looked saddened somewhat as they approached. "Chris, you should see this," Austin said in a low tone while Hal nodded. I didn't have anything else to do and followed them as they led me through a trail in the woods that looked recently traveled. Not well traveled enough to form a natural path, but enough to tell human activity had been through the area after the change. It looked like someone attempted to cover their tracks but wasn't proficient at it just yet. "Where does this lead? Are there people around here?" I asked, grasping for my hammer. If there was a group in these woods, a little heads up would have been nice. I was always ready for combat, but they should have mentioned that before leading me away. "No, not in the sense you are thinking," Hal said cryptically. "You'll see." His words made me leave the hammer on my back as we continued along the trail of broken twigs and ruffled leaves until we came upon a smaller clearing than the one we set up in. It was so small it didn't even show up on the map. Inside the clearing was a 2-story log cabin of a house that had a dirt road leading away from it and into the distance. It was overgrown with plant life, but the remnants of the road were easy enough to see. The cabin itself had seen better days, but it held up remarkably well to the months of terraforming. All the walls still stood, and only a handful of holes were in the roof. It looked infinitely better than the houses I had seen in the city, which were barely standing. Some of the houses in the city had collapsed down to the foundation level. "What's this doing here? Is there a town around here we don't know about?" I questioned quietly. Finding a random house in the woods wasn't what I thought they would lead me to. I had expected to find a monster of some kind or an unusual area they had found. Austin had done that a few times in the past whenever he found something cool or unusual. One time it resulted in my foot getting snagged by a random vine that tried to strangle my thigh. Seeing it promptly frozen solid and shattered doused Austin's enthusiasm at seeing my surprise. Other than the grasping vines that he discovered, he also tried to surprise me with a snake that could turn itself invisible. There were a few other oddities we had come across along the way that he dragged me over to see. Finding a house was a new discovery. As we were observing the house, I noticed movement inside of it. A curtain moved inside a window and I immediately went on alert. My hand whipped behind me, but Austin's hand caught me before I could pull it off. I gave him a quizzical look at being stopped, but he only shook his head slowly. "What aren't you telling me?" I yelled quietly. This experience was getting strange and I wanted to know what was going on. First the odd house, and now he was stopping me from preparing. "It's a child in there," he said. "She's barely old enough to unlock a class and she isn't even over level 10 yet." Hal picked up after Austin stopped. "We came across her while she was traveling the woods. We expected to find more people around and followed for a while before being led here." His face set harder before ending, "There's no one else around." Just as they finished filling me in, a high-pitched voice sounded out from inside the cabin. If I hadn't known it was a child, there would have been no way to tell from the voice. Its pitch was obviously feminine but had a sternness and determination to it that made it hard to picture coming from a child. "Don't come any closer or I'll shoot." I looked at the two men next to me confused. Was she in there pointing a gun at us? We had seen a few people with them, but they were almost entirely phased out by the weapons people picked up in the tutorial. Swords or axes and the like were more commonly seen than guns since we had returned. Rangers with a bow could do the same amount of damage as a gun if they had the skills for it and were high enough level. I was confident that I could take a bullet from a gun, but that mostly depended on the caliber. Smaller caliber ones would be easy enough to shrug off, but bigger ones with more power? Without any way to know what she had, I was uncertain if I was in danger. For all I knew, she could have a cannon pointed at me. "We're just traveling through the area and came across your cabin. We don't mean any trouble," I said back. I put my hands up to signify that as I stopped approaching the house. There was a few beats of silence before a figure popped up from behind a window. The curtains moved to reveal the person that was behind them, and the origin of the voice became visible. It looked like a young girl just above the age of 14 or 15. Dirt covered her face and was caked in her hair that made it look like she hadn't bathed in a week. I couldn't tell if her hair was naturally brown or if it was from all the dirt in it making it that way. We also weren't the cleanest, but we looked better than her. Those in the caravan with water skills could create enough to wash in while we traveled. In her hands was a bow drawn taut, pointed right at me. It made me relieved to know it was a bow and arrow rather than a firearm, but it was still drawn on me. The bow looked like the starter ones the Rangers received at the beginning, and I knew those weren't very powerful. Strength could be deceiving now that you couldn't estimate it from muscle mass, though. Sure, muscles grew like normal, but my 600 points of it didn't look all that different from Jonathan's 300. Austin had already informed me that she was under level 10, but I shot off an identify C. Just to make sure. Human, level 9. Even though I knew what it would say, it still shocked me. Just seeing that it was so low was something new. The lowest level I had seen since returning was the low 20s, but this was even below that. After identify C. Pinged the girl. I got a better look at her. She looked half-starved and was sickly thin. Her arms were stick-thin and trembled holding the bow pulled. I wasn't sure what she had been eating, but she wasn't getting enough of it. "Here, I have some berries and nuts you can eat if you want." "Sorry, I don't have anything more, but most of the food is at the caravan," I said, drawing my snack food from a pouch on my belt. I could see her eyes lock onto the offered food, but she didn't show any other sign of letting up. Her bow stayed pointed at me the whole time. "Is there anybody else here? Where's your parents?" I asked her. At the mention of her parents, her eyes tore away from the food back to me with intensity, and she tightened her grip on the bow. It was clear that something had happened to them. "My dad should be coming back soon." He was here when we left, and he will show up any second now, and he doesn't like people near his cabin," she said sternly. It was clearly a lie, but it told me more than she knew. Her father was with her in the cabin before the tutorial started, but he hadn't returned with her afterward. She had been alone in the cabin for over a week, made to fend for herself. My heart ached at her predicament, but it also bled for another reason. Her father was dead. We were able to speak with multiple different people who experienced different tutorials, and all of them had the same experience. Anyone who didn't return was dead. The system returned you to the same spot you were taken from, and if that didn't occur, there was only one explanation. Hearing that saddened me, and before I knew it, I stepped closer to comfort the child without thinking. Whether it was the sudden movement or the fact I stepped closer after being told not to, she released the bowstring before I could realize what I was doing. My mind was so muddled I didn't even react in time until after the arrow pinged off my chest. The arrowhead broke off and the shaft shattered into pieces as it hit me. I wasn't wearing my armor anymore, which made it clear to see where the arrow was aimed. It hit the left center of my chest, right where my heart resided, but it didn't have the power to penetrate my skin. Both my fortitude and my body of wood were enough to stop the weak arrow cold and shatter it to pieces. As what happened filtered through my brain, I couldn't help but look down at my chest and laugh. Ha! She really shot me. Chapter 142, The Sad Part. The face the girl made at seeing her arrow bounce off my chest almost had me bursting out in laughter, but I held it in. The girl was terrified, and laughing at her wouldn't help matters. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you," I said softly. "Why don't you tell me your name?" She was hesitant at first, but she eventually told me her name. "It's Sarah," she mumbled. "Well, hello, Sarah. My name is Christopher," I responded lightly. Her eyes couldn't leave the spot her arrow hit, and it seemed she couldn't keep her question in any longer. "How did you do that?" "Do what? The arrow?" I chuckled. "Oh, you have to do a lot more than that to hurt me." I didn't want to overwhelm the girl, so I took it slow, introducing myself and talking for a moment. "Why don't you come out here so we can talk? You can have all the snacks I have too," I said, waving my bag of snacks at her. I wasn't sure it would work, but she eventually stepped out of the house for the promise of food. After she did, I introduced her to Austin and Hal. She made a face seeing that Hal was a ranger, but no one commented on it. We did our best not to startle her any more than we already had, as no one wanted to get shot with another arrow. After talking for a short while and getting some food in her, the girl broke down into tears and cried while hugging onto me. That was a development I hadn't expected. The girl was fine, and then all of a sudden she was overflowing with tears holding on to me. "It's been so hard, sniffle. I did the best I could, but I'm too low level. Luke won't stop crying, and I don't have anything to feed him, sniffle." She sobbed into my shirt. Austin had been trying to hold in his laughter at seeing my awkwardness around the crying child holding on to me, but at the mention of another, he broke away to search the house and found a 6-year-old kid inside. There were 2 kids in the house. It took a while, but we managed to convince her and her brother to come back to our camp for a warm meal. I didn't carry that much food with me, and the rest was back at camp. Coming back with 2 children in tow caused some confusion until we told everyone the story. The girl, Sarah, recounted her experience in the tutorial, and I couldn't help but sigh at what I heard. The dad was just trying to take care of her and keep her safe, but he ended up causing more harm than good. Without any levels, the girl was woefully unprepared for when her father didn't come back and nearly died of starvation. Still, she was a tough cookie, and I had to admire that grit. I had to hunt for food, and I managed to get a deer, but that was a while ago. The meat went bad quickly, and I wasn't able to find anything else I could kill. Everything's level was too high, she told in between bites of food. I was surprised she even managed that. She was only level 9 without even her first-class evolution. Some of the beasts around here were in the E rank already, let alone the amount that were higher level than her. After getting her a meal and letting her wash up, I met with Austin and Abigail, who were discussing something in whispered tones. "Do you know what she has to evolve into for that to work?" Austin said. "I'm not 100% sure, but it shouldn't be hard to figure out," Abigail answered. I caught the tail end of what they were discussing as I walked up and couldn't help but frown. "Please tell me you guys aren't already discussing this." We haven't even asked the girl her opinion on the matter, and you two are already hashing things out. I admonished them both. You can't say you haven't thought of it, Austin said back. While he was correct, it wasn't something we should be talking about so soon. That was one of the first things that came to mind when I found out about her class and level, but it wasn't time for that yet. Even if a ranger pre their first evolution was the perfect chance to raise a beastmaster. I wanted to have a bit more tact going about it though. Let the girl get accustomed to us before dropping this on her. Why don't you take a beat and let her settle first? She was hesitant to even come back with us, let alone come with us. We should give her a few days before bringing this up. We've pulled the carts for a week already. A few more days won't hurt, I said. Yeah, but it sucks, Austin whined. Shut up, you don't even pull them most of the time, Abigail pointed out. Austin was mainly on scouting duty around the caravan, but there were times when he had turns pulling the carts. It wasn't often, but it did happen. Plus, even if we raise her level and get her the class, it isn't like we have horses at the ready. There aren't any beasts around here we can use anyway, I said, going back to the issue at hand. Fine, we can wait, but I'll be keeping a lookout for anything we can use, Austin conceded. I didn't want to hear any more talk of that until at least a few days from now. There was no need to rush, and I wasn't going to force the class on the girl. To switch topics, I brought up the other reason we had stopped here for the night. Has Hal found the dungeon yet? I asked. He had been sent out after our run-in at the cabin to search for the dungeon that was around here. After over a week of travel, we had finally come across one of them on the map. We knew we were close based on the map, but we hadn't managed to pinpoint it yet. It was also what Austin was supposed to be doing given his profession. I didn't know all of his professional skills, but there should be one or two that would help him locate the thing. Not yet. It wasn't like we were able to give him coordinates to the thing. It's going to take him a while to find. Abigail huffed in annoyance at my question. I had been bothering her about it quite a few times. I know. It's fine, I sighed. I'm just looking forward to a fight is all. None of the beasts around here can hold up. Abigail looked at me strangely but didn't say more. Austin, why don't make yourself useful and go help him? I added. He mumbled a complaint but went out into the woods all the same. Abigail and I stood in silence for a while before she brought up something new. How do you think the rest of the world is doing? She asked out of the blue. The question was sudden and I wasn't prepared to be asked something like that. How the hell am I supposed to know? I answered. You've seen just as much of it as I have. I don't know. She sighed. I just can't help but think about if other people are out there like Sarah. I took a second to ponder on it before I shook my head to move on. The sad part was that there are probably plenty more people out there like Sarah. Nick. Point of view. Crack boom. Another lightning bolt leapt from his hand, electrocuting yet another monster. Nick hadn't expected a wave of monsters to attack after he placed the pylon, but he was more than enough to take care of them. His lightning could kill them with ease, and he shot them down as quickly as he could. He had received the pylon at the end of the tutorial for a decent amount of points, and he thought it would let him run a city. That it would turn him into a city lord or something like that. He hadn't expected to be bombarded by monsters the second he placed the thing down. Nick was lucky he had met up with other people before he went through with it, or he would have had to face them all alone. While he could have beaten the wave alone, the people around him helped keep them away so he could focus on shooting them down. When he returned, the pylon gave off a beacon of sorts that people could feel from a distance away, and it caused them to investigate the disturbance. Some wanted to take it from him, but he easily fried those who would do him harm. He didn't slack off in the tutorial, and he doubted many around were stronger than him. Others joined up after realizing what it was. No one else around had a pylon, and people were eager to rebuild some semblance of safety with it. Any of the would-be thieves were brutally killed, and he made sure to display his strength. Plus, his rare mana affinity made him a step above the rest. The storm affinity had been his stepping stone to higher power since it revealed itself when he hit level 10. The winds and rain flared out as he pulled on more of his mana to fight off the horde. Bolts of lightning shot out when he had the chance, and he could see the beasts faltering. His retinue did a wonderful job of keeping the monsters off of him, which left him open to launching his skills without worry. Most of the monsters were in the high 30s, but there were a few that were higher. Those he had to fry a few times before they went down. As the last beast he could see succumb to electricity, he couldn't keep the satisfaction off his face. Right as he was feeling satisfied, the pylon sent out a pulse of white light going out in every direction. The sphere of white extended out 100 yards before it stopped and fizzled out. A notification popped up after the light went away, and Nick laughed at the sight. He had done it. He had claimed his first piece of land, and he could now build his very own city. Name your outpost. He knew that he probably wasn't the first, as a week had already gone by, but he couldn't help but feel like he was one of the firsts. Now all he had to do was name it. Nick's city had a nice ring to it, but he wasn't so childish to name it after himself. He could rename it the same name as before, but he didn't wish to do that either. That name was for a city from before. This needed something new. He minimized the notification so he could put it off for later. He didn't have to name it right this second, and he wanted to think of a good one first. Plus, there were other things to do right now besides naming his newly claimed land. Have you found any builders yet? Nick asked his second in command. Ever since people started to gather toward Nick and his pylon, he had to come up with a way to keep things orderly. That all started with his second, who made things so much easier. She was perfect for the role and even had a profession dedicated to it, which only made things easier, let alone her experience from the tutorial. Yes, sir. We managed to find a few throughout the city, and they are willing to help for the time being. His second responded. Perfect. Let's get started on turning this into an actual city rather than only a plot of land. Nick announced excitedly. He couldn't wait to see what it would turn into. Chapter 143, First Coin. Chris. Point of view. So this is it? This is a dungeon? I asked after arriving at the place Austin indicated. Hal was a bit miffed that he spent hours searching for it only to have Austin find it rather than him, but that went to show the power of professions. Hal's dismantler profession was never going to beat out Austin's explorer at finding something no one had found before. Yep, this is it, baby, Austin said proudly, hands at his sides as we gazed at his discovery. All three of us, Hal, Austin, and me, stood and examined the place around us. The dungeon looked little different than a random hole in the ground, but it was markedly different to any mana sense. It glowed when looked at through that lens, taking in more mana than I had in me by several orders of magnitude. I wasn't sure of the science behind it, but just by looking at it, it was easy to tell why the mana density rose around the area. Why does it siphon mana from the area like that? Hal asked as we all stood and watched. It flowed. Not gently, but with enough speed to be noticeable toward where the ground opened. Gravity had no effect on the flow, as some of the mana was coming from down the slope we were standing on. I think it's supposed to be a filter for it or something, Austin voiced his opinion. No, I thought it needed mana to grow and spawn monsters, I rebutted. A new voice interrupted our conversation from behind us. One I really should have seen coming. No, you idiots. If you actually listened when I spoke, you would know the answer already, Abigail said while carrying Gabriel on her back. His bandaged legs stuck out a little longer than before, but he was still a long way away from walking on his own. The healers were still working out the most efficient way to regrow them, but the process had at least started. It took nearly 6 people to work and a shit ton of healing mana, but it was working. Rachel had to use Ritual Cast to link all of the healers together so they could pool all of their skills together. The healing was slow going and mana intensive, but it was still going. While we trained together, he had made attempts to create legs made of ice, but it hadn't worked well enough yet. It took too much control to make everything work, and he wasn't there yet. He was certainly getting better, but it would be a while until he could make icy legs work. By the time he had the fine control down, his legs would be mostly regrown by then. Keeping his balance was the hardest part. Any sort of weight shift or uneven ground sent him toppling to the ground as he couldn't shift as fast as required. It was hard to witness at first, but he was working through it. The small muscles for balance did more than what he could stimulate with his magic, at least for now. The dungeon is both a filter and it requires mana to grow and populate the dungeon, so you both are right but also wrong. The monsters aren't spawned from mana. They are transported here from other places. Everything in there is a real monster, not something that's only conjured from mana. She corrected. Yeah, that's the reason the monsters don't disappear after you kill them, and you can take their parts outside of the dungeon after you finish, Gabriel added. What began as a simple curiosity quickly became a lecture when those two got involved. They went on to give a little more detail about them, but my interest started to get distracted after a while. I was glad to hear that the monsters inside were real. I wasn't sure what else they would be, but I was worried they wouldn't feel the same. Like fighting a hologram or something if they were mana constructs the dungeon made. The logistics of how that worked were still above us, much to Abigail's chagrin, but we knew that they were taken from somewhere else for some reason or another. Every piece of information about dungeons we had learned, either from our own tutorial or Gabriel's, seemed to deliberately leave that part out. Like the system didn't want us to know the specifics of it just yet. For as much as we were given in-depth information about some things, others were withheld for seemingly no reason. While the history of dungeons was interesting and all, there was something much more important I wanted to know. How deep is it? I asked. From the quick lesson Gabriel and my mother gave us of their tutorial, we learned that dungeons had floors and each floor increased in strength from the last. Their tutorial's dungeon ranged from level 1 all the way to over level 50. Every floor had a range of 10 levels capped by a boss monster, or floor guardian depending on which name you wanted to use. There were other things that could be inside of a dungeon, but they were by no means standard. Every dungeon was a touch different, and you couldn't go into them thinking they would be the same. Some would have more traps than others. Some would have mini-bosses spread throughout certain floors. Some had a steep challenge increase from floor to floor, while others had a smoother curve. What was most important was the amount of floors it had. At least that was most important to me right now. The loot the dungeon would drop was also important, but that was of secondary importance right now. A good fight was something I desired more than anything the dungeon could drop. We don't have any tools to measure that, and it's impossible to tell without them. None of us have that good of a mana sense to detect the amount of floors the dungeon has, Gabriel said. Especially with this being the first one we've come across and without previous ones to compare against. Not getting an answer right now was disappointing, but it wasn't the end of the world. I guess we'll have to find out the hard way, I said excitedly, pulling my hammer from my back and started walking toward it. After hearing that Austin had found the dungeon, I had come prepared for battle. My armor was dusted off from its stay in storage and sat comfortably on my shoulders again. The familiar weight was comforting to wear again after not doing so while we traveled. Not wearing it was an attempt at what Abigail claimed would acclimate me to being back. I didn't think it worked, but it was nice to not wear the cumbersome plate as much, even though it felt weird not to. My hammer had gotten a bit of love since the end of the tutorial, but it could also use a decent fight again. Abigail shook her head behind me at my enthusiasm, but none of them made to stop me. They knew I was looking forward to this and was half the reason we stopped where we did. Come on, Nightlight. I don't know if I'll be able to see in here, I shouted over my shoulder to my dungeon companion for the day. I was not about to carry a torch down there. It felt like an affront to bring fire with me while fighting, not when I had such a willing participant to light the way right next to me. We had already planned out who would go in the dungeon, and Austin and I were up first to scout it out. Everyone else had other tasks to do that pushed their turn for later or after the threat level was established. Jonathan was a good option to scope it out along with Hal and Rachel, but none had the same enthusiasm about it than I did and let me go first. They didn't care for the fights of the tutorial as much as I did. Oh, is Big Bad Christopher scared of the dark? Austin mocked but started following anyway. The two of us approached the cavern, and I almost expected to feel something as we crossed the threshold, but I didn't. The mana was thicker, but that was about it. I half expected some kind of sensation to come over me or a feeling to signify I was in a dungeon, but nothing changed. The slope wasn't too steep, and we marched on into the depths. It was similar to walking inside of a normal cave. The air grew muggier and the light level decreased as we made our way deeper, but it didn't have the wetness you would expect from a cave, and stalactites dripping water from the ceiling were missing. The rough stone and jutting rocks were the only sights as we descended, and it became increasingly dark until Austin powered up one of his skills. As much as I joked at him about it, he did make a really good night light. It was a subtler glow compared to the luminescence I had seen him put out before, but it was enough for us to see. It worked well to not completely kill our dark vision. If it stayed that way when he started launching skills was yet to be seen. Do you still gain strength from Rising Dawn, even though you're underground? I asked curiously. Probably wasn't the best time for idle conversation, but the thought popped into my head and I became curious. Rising Dawn was the skill that gave him strength during the day and peaked at noon. It was a similar type of skill to my glacial presence, but instead of relying on the temperature around me, it was tied to the height of the sun. Yes, I still get the boost from it. The sun is still up even though I am underground. It doesn't stop being up even though I can't see it. Austin answered sarcastically. Something about that didn't seem right. I feel like that's cheating. The sun doesn't even reach here. How does it give you strength? He looked over at me a touch more serious than normal. The sun is more than just light. I wanted to ask how that worked exactly, but our conversation was cut short as we ran into our first monster. We were only a few hundred feet into the dungeon and we already hit our first monster. It was an odd little thing to look at. We were only on the first floor, so it wasn't that high level, not even above level 10, but it was still an odd thing to look at. It was like no animal I had seen before, but even without knowing what it was, there was clearly something wrong with it. It was salivating excessively and heavy breathing could be heard from it. It lumbered down the passage we were walking with its back turned to us. It was a surprise it hadn't noticed us. Most beasts knew I was there before the reverse was true. I was no expert veterinarian, but it reminded me of rabies or something like that. The monsters that came in the waves were sort of like this, but this one was far worse. It gave off a sense of unnaturalness as well that was unpleasant. The feeling wasn't the same as the demonic leopards, but it was similar in the wrongness it gave off. We knew that the dungeon monsters would be like this from Gabriel, but seeing it firsthand was different. It was the main reason that the monsters were inedible. Looking at the thing, I knew no one would want to eat it, but seeing that it was most likely diseased only made it worse. Identify C. Said it was only level 3, a small little thing. Do you want to give it a poke, or do you want me to? I whispered to Austin with a shrug. Be my guest. He waved me ahead. I gave it a light tap and we were on our way again. The rest of the floor was similar and was made for people way lower level than us. The gradual slope had leveled off after we hit the first floor and became more flat, but the monsters stayed the same. There were still dips and bumps, but it stayed generally level the rest of the way, with the monsters all being under level 10. We breezed by most of the monsters with either an ice arrow or a solar beam, and spent little time on them. They didn't have any parts that were useful to gather and were a waste of time to try and skin. The winding path was tall enough for us to stand up straight in, luckily, and it wasn't that hard to navigate. It had areas where the ceiling was higher, but it mostly stayed at around 10 feet or so. The walls were rough stone and came in tight in some areas, but it looked and felt like a normal cave. The floor guardian only took a smidge more effort, but it was easily defeated. It reminded me of the first time we took on a level 10 boar. The first evolution gap between level 9 and 10 had seemed so steep then. Back then, it took everything in me to kill the boar, when now it was as easy as waving my hand. Not all dungeons had to stick with the same 10 levels of floor standard, but it was nice that our first delve into one was one we had experience with. Not personal experience, but a first-hand account was close. After we killed the floor guardian, we made our way around the room in search of the reward chest. We were told that they were rewarded after completing each floor and only appeared after the floor guardian was defeated. It really is a treasure chest, Austin exclaimed from the other side of the room. I quickly made my way over to him and examined the box he was staring at. It was a rectangular chest that was only around 2 feet wide and a foot deep. It wasn't even that tall either, at only about a foot high. Whatever was in there wasn't very big. Well, open it up, I told him. He quickly lifted the lid and revealed what was inside. There were a few copper coins laid out inside the box with a chunk of metal next to them. My metallurgy skill was saying it was similar in strength to high-carbon steel. I examined the chunk of metal a bit more, but nothing new jumped out at me. Vinny would have to look at it with material analysis to get a better appraisal, but it didn't stand out to my senses. If the color hadn't given them away as copper coins, the lackluster prize of the first floor definitely did. The loot was disappointing, but we didn't expect much for the first floor. Our first coin. Should we frame it? Austin joked, picking up one of the coins inside the chest. Chapter 144, Richest. You know, I really thought there would be stairs. Austin's voice echoed off the cave walls we were traveling down. We were in the process of making our way down to the 5th floor after defeating the 4th floor guardian, and it was taking longer than usual. The tunnel extended on for quite a while without a monster to fight, leaving us alone with only our footfalls echoing off the tunnel to accompany us. The 4th guardian was a massive lizard the size of a car that had an earth affinity to help it out. Well, the affinity didn't do much to us, but to anyone else it would be a difficult fight. We were a great distance below ground and were surrounded by stone and rock on all sides. The thing literally ripped chunks of it out of the walls and ceiling to use. It was a touch unfair in my opinion, but the thing died all the same. Like in games? I questioned. Yeah, I can see it. Maybe some dungeons do have stairs? Not all of them are the same apparently. Our conversation broke the silence we were in and carried through the open tunnel. The quiet was odd at first but quickly became normal after traveling through 4 floors. Where do you think the monsters come from? Austin asked. What do you think's wrong with them? I just turned and gave him a dumb look. His ball of light illuminating the area made the face I was making at him visible even if he didn't turn to face me. He knew what I was doing. Man, you are asking the wrong person. You just had a chance to ask the 2 most knowledgeable on dungeons and you waited to ask me? I joked. We both chuckled at that, but Austin continued. That was different. We were being told what to expect, but now I've actually seen it. I've fought them for 4 floors and have experienced it myself. It just made me curious where they came from. I don't know, man. Do you remember the demonic leopards from the tutorial? He nodded, letting me continue. They kind of remind me of them with the feeling they give off. Huh, you're right, Austin replied. But it's different somehow. I know, but I don't have anything else to compare it to. We lapsed into comfortable silence after that until Austin brought up a different subject. You know, we're probably some of the richest people in the world right now, he said with a laugh. That brought a smile to my face, but I just shook my head at him. The 1st floor rewarded us with a few copper coins and a chunk of low-grade metal. The 2nd floor gave a few more coins and a square of leather. The 3rd gave a few more coins and a different bit of material, and by then, I was sensing a theme. The only difference on the 3rd was the coins were shaped differently. The coins rewarded on the 1st and 2nd floors were small rounds of copper of a similar size to nickels, but the ones on the 3rd floor were a touch bigger. Not as big as a quarter, but in between 2 in size. They were also a touch thicker. While the tutorial didn't give us any coins, it wasn't hard to figure out what our new currency would be from the store. The smaller, thinner coins were only a single copper, while the bigger ones were worth 10. There was also one worth 25, and it went as large as a half piece, but we didn't have any of those yet. Those different sizes stayed constant through the different metals, so it was the same for copper, silver, gold, and whatever was above that. We were still getting used to the new currency, but it would quickly become familiar in time, as most things did. Between us, we barely had 30 copper to our name, yet he was already claiming riches. Think about it. How many people do you think have been in a dungeon yet and received a coin? I'd say less than 10% of the population has a coin. Maybe less than 5%. So, technically, we are the top 10% now, he said excitedly, rubbing 2 of the coins together. That's a stretch, even for you. I shot down. We joked back and forth as we walked, but it was never about serious topics. Mostly stupid jokes as we descended further. Neither of us received a level, which was unfortunate, but we were looking forward to what the lower floors would offer. If there were lower floors. The 5th was the last floor before Erank started to populate the tunnels, and the boss was the first one with a law, but it was only at least one at that. The rewards continued to be a mixture of coins and materials, which was a tad disappointing. We knew some dungeons could reward skill shards, but this one seemed to be a material dungeon. While it would be a boon to any crafters that settled nearby, it wasn't the exciting finds that we were looking forward to. The 6th was when it finally started to get good. I could have blazed through quickly on my own, but we took it slow to explore everything and be a touch cautious. Neither of us had trap detecting skills and had no way to discern if any were there. This dungeon didn't seem to favor them, but we couldn't rule them out outright. We bulldozed through the few that populated the higher floors like they were decorative paper rather than the lethal traps they were supposed to be. We kept that stance as we descended, but we were trying to be more careful. My stats were high enough, my fortitude especially, to walk through most of them, and my armor added to that capability. Both my armor of ice and the plate I wore under it. I felt confident enough to walk through them for at least a few more floors. After that, things would get iffy and a new tactic would need to be found. This was only supposed to be an initial survey of the dungeon for people who would come in after us. We wouldn't be staying here for long, but there would be enough time to get people down in here a few times. Maybe I could take Allison with me? She had the best trap detection skill, being a rogue-turned-trapper herself, but that depended on how many floors the dungeon had. If it capped at 6 or 7, I could brave them myself. Any higher and I would have to get help. Going face-first into a trap meant for level 80s was pushing it, even for me. The 6th floor took a touch longer since the monsters had evolved again, but they went down quickly. Especially with Austin here to help. We had fought together a great many times, and we ended the tutorial on nearly 30 straight hours of it. By this point, it was instinctual to account for what he would do in the fight. Gabriel babbled on about combination moves we could use together, but we hadn't tried any out. The attempt at using my ice as a magnifying glass for his light didn't work as well as Gabriel planned. My ice wasn't crystal clear, and the small imperfections ruined the effect. The water mages, though, were perfect for the effect. Any solar beam that passed through the water got a moderate power boost from the effect. The range was diminished, but it was still stronger than before. We relied on good old-fashioned teamwork. His spear blurred as he thrusted through the beasts while I smashed any and all in front of me. By now, momentum had built up since the 1st floor and was nearly full just from walking through the floors. As we reached the end of the 6th floor, we finally reached monsters that were higher level than us. Well, higher level than me. Austin was over level 60 already. Please be another floor. Please be another floor. I chanted under my breath as we closed in on the floor guardian. It was just starting to get good, and I didn't want it to end yet. There hadn't even been a decent fight yet, nor had I received a level. The guardian was a step above the rest, but still only had least law to defend itself, and no other path was present. No anchor or body refining to help it defend against my hammer. Beasts didn't have the same exact paths as us, but they were similar enough to be called the same things. The techniques were certainly different, but it was still referred to as anchors and body refining. One cool tidbit we read was certain territorial beasts could make a place their anchor. There was an example of a giant anthill that nearly every ant made their spiritual anchor. The army fielded to conquer said anthill all died spectacularly, even though they were all of a higher level. The power an entire anthill could bring to bear with their combined spirit was too much to handle. It happened long ago, but was used as an example that places could also be used as anchors. Even though beasts used them more commonly, humans could as well. Laws were the same regardless of race. Those were the guidelines of the universe. They didn't change whether you were a mouse, bear, or human. After Austin speared the guardian through the heart, causing it to slump over dead, I ran around the room looking for the way down and nearly jumped in joy when I found one. I left Austin to gather the rewards and forced him to pick up the pace as we went down a floor. The level 70 monsters were where my challenge lay. I could feel it. I relegated myself to only my law and physical stats during the fights, and they became the challenge I wanted. Some of the beasts even had more stats than I did. Agility was my biggest challenge, handicapped as I was. With Austin here to help, it wasn't too bad, but I could see that getting out of hand if I fought too far up in level. A slow skill with my ice would be a great addition to my power set if I could find one. That would counter any who tried to beat me using speed. The fights leading deeper into the 7th floor started to get my blood pumping again. My hammer shook off the rust and danced through the air again. Felt like it had been months since my last good fight. Even though I was restraining myself, it worked to loosen my limbs and get into it again. Mighty blow came down on a skull, exploding it in a shower of gore while Austin stabbed out at a monster behind me. I marched forward to meet the next monster, and he stayed a step behind me. As the monsters started reaching above level 75, they became a touch stronger. They received a second path and had either a tough body or greater magic. It seemed like the midpoint of E rank was another power jump for the dungeon. It would have been a challenge to stay handicapped as I was, so I began to use my anchor as well. It was especially necessary for the groups of them around the tunnels. They were a good mix of tough brawlers, swift assassins, and powerful magicians. Or at least that was what Austin and I came up with for naming them. The tough brawlers were the monsters with powerful bodies that liked to get up close and maul you, going blow for blow, relying on their defenses to ward off attacks. The swift assassins were the flighty ones who danced around while looking for openings to exploit. They usually had sharp claws or talons they used in quick slashes before leaping out of range. I compared them to mine and Austin's fighting style respectively. The last were the mages. They stood back while the others fought and used magic, launching whatever skills they had. Those were the most annoying to deal with, and I usually focused on those with a vengeance. A law and spirit-infused ice arrow or something similar sent their way was usually enough to either kill them outright or put them out of the fight. Even dealing with the annoying ones, it was nice to fight again, to wade through enemies and come out the other side. I even got a chime to push my good mood even further. Congratulations, you have leveled up. Chapter 145. Not a ranger. God damn it. It's a tease. I screamed in frustration at the empty tunnel ahead of us. Austin and I had just finished the 7th floor guardian and were making our way down to the 8th when the tunnel abruptly ended. As we neared where it ended, the tunnel took on a rougher and more unkempt look, which should have made the end less surprising, but my mind didn't want it to be so. The 7th floor guardian was a great fight where Austin and I had to go near full power to defeat it, and it promised a fun time on the 8th, but it wasn't to be so. It had teased us with a good fight only to leave us stranded looking for more. It still has 7 floors, Christopher. What did you expect from a new dungeon? Austin tried to soothe my frustration, but it did little. I was eager for a good fight, but it seemed I would be denied, which was annoying. I hereby name this dungeon Tease, for being a jackass and not giving me a good fight, I declared in the barren tunnel. Naming the dungeon wouldn't actually do anything, but it felt good to spite it, even if it was inanimate without a clue that I was cursing it. Dungeons didn't have names, not really anyway. Civilizations still gave them names to refer to them better, but those were by no means system enforced. It was just people collectively agreeing to call it the same thing for convenience's sake. Facing the dead end, we had to march all the way back to the surface, and my frustration bled out of me as we hiked back. It was hard to stay mad about it while taking a half hour to get back. Overall, the whole dungeon run took a few hours, and we were only a few coins richer along with various bits of material. The dungeon loot was lackluster, but we were warned it would be such. When we got back to camp, I made sure everyone referred to the dungeon as the name I bestowed upon it, if only for my own amusement. After it was scouted out and the difficulty level for the floors was known, people started to sign up to go down into it. Where these dungeons differed from games was they weren't instanced or anything like that. They only had room for a few groups, and everyone couldn't rush down into it at once. A sign-up sheet was made, and people gathered together in groups to go down into it. Each dungeon was a touch different in how long before resets based on mana level and intake, but this one reset in about an hour. I didn't know if that was fast or slow, but we were able to send a team every hour or so into the dungeon to get some experience. Most hadn't passed the E-rank threshold yet, and they wouldn't be able to get anywhere near the end of the dungeon, which made it a good spot for them to level up, even if I couldn't. During this time, some of the major adjustments we had put off were starting to take place. Normally, we only had roughly 10 hours of downtime on the wagons to work on them while they weren't moving, and we had to make use of this extended time while we had it. From sunset to sunrise, with a few breaks throughout the day, we were on the road. I didn't count the breaks during the day in the 10 hours because those weren't consecutive, and it was hard to do anything substantial to the carts during the short time we stopped. But now, when we camped in the same spot for multiple days, major repairs and upgrades were happening. Braden and Vinny had both thought of different ways to improve the wagons and were quickly doing so while they had the time. There were a few other builders and carpenters we picked up along the way who helped out as well. Plus, I took some time to carve a few runes in them for added measure. We were traveling through what used to be Indiana right now, which was mostly flat with only a few hills, but we would eventually reach rougher terrain. We were still having problems on flat ground, and I wanted to beef the carts up a bit before we ran into anything too difficult. Least runes of durability were my main work as I put them at various places along the cart. We ran a few tests and found that it worked best if I engraved every spoke of the wagon wheel separately, as doing so strengthened them the most and produced the lowest chance of breaking, which meant I had to carve 8 spokes per wheel on a 4-wheeled cart in a multiple-cart caravan. I didn't want to see my carving tool or another spoke for a long time after that. Still, we made the upgrades and it gave people enough time to have their fill of the dungeon. Each group managed to go in it a few times and most came out with a good chunk of essence. It was the first time our caravan leveled up as a whole and multitudes of people were sporting new skills they were showing off. Whether they worked on the upgrades and had new builder skills or fought in the dungeon and had new combat skills, both groups had something new to play with. Sarah took this time to get acquainted with the group and came out of her shell a bit. She spent most of her time with the other parents or caretakers since she wouldn't let her little brother out of her sight, but she gradually opened up as well. I could tell she had the urge to go into the dungeon but didn't want to leave her brother alone with people she didn't know. It was both admirable and sad what she was going through. Abigail was the person I designated to be her handler. That word sounded wrong, but that was essentially what she did. Being a mother herself, it helped her deal with the barely 15-year-old girl and her young brother. It helped that Sarah's brother, Zach, was the same age as Josh, Abigail's youngest. They got along decent enough, and it was nice to see Josh playing with someone his own age. We had a smattering of different age groups of kids, but few age groups had multiple kids that could play together. We stayed for 4 days before I felt it was time to present the question. Sarah seemed more relaxed, and a lot of the tension she had been carrying was released. Zach and Josh got along during the day, and she internalized she didn't have to do everything alone anymore. She wasn't the sole person who had to feed, watch, protect, and take care of a 6-year-old child. While it was satisfying to see her transition, I still waited a bit longer than I should have. The importance a Beastmaster held was tremendous, and we still had to do a lot of work to raise her up. Austin pressured me to hurry, but I was unswayed. He and Hal had found an abandoned ranch a few hours away that held the promise of horses. The signs were all there, but the animals themselves were missing. It looked like a ranch from before had been there, and that meant there were horses somewhere in the area. Unless they all ran away, we were hopeful to find at least a few. The stable they found had the capacity for a good number of them, and we were searching for a decent-sized herd of the creatures in the area. I felt he had ranged far and wide to find something like it that would satisfy my condition. His pressure didn't sway my decision, but it was time to pose the question. I couldn't delay it forever. The first thing I did was bring Abigail with me, both to have a friendly face along with the person she had grown closest to while among us. I had been too busy to spend much time with her, and we remained distant. I had more than just work to eat up my time. Everyone needed me for one thing or another, which made my time fleeting. I was actively refining what my authority was needed for, so I didn't get called for superfluous things, but we were still new and starting out, and people didn't know what to do. "Sarah, can you come with me?" I asked when I reached her. Her eyes flicked to Abigail behind me and nodded hesitantly. She seemed fearful of me, like she knew how powerful I truly was. Most who joined hadn't seen me at full power. Only my family knew what I was capable of, and they hadn't witnessed it firsthand. None were there to see me fight the waves, but they knew the aftermath. There wasn't a need to bring that part out, and most remained ignorant. But Sarah knew she didn't have the capability to hurt me from experience, which was more than most. I didn't wish to intimidate everyone, so I kept it mostly lighthearted and personable while we traveled, but she knew for a fact that there was nothing she could do. Our trio walked back to my tent, and I sat down in a chair set up for the occasion. I faced 2 other chairs with a small table in between us, which was a clear indicator of the conversation we were to have. Sarah tentatively sat in one while Abigail slid into the other next to her. "How have you been these last few days? Are you settling in all right?" I tried to ease into the conversation, but it didn't seem to work. Even as she tried to casually answer, her tenseness was clear. Fine. Everything has been wonderful. Thank you for taking us in." She stuttered through some of it, but that was fine. Seeing how she was going to remain tense no matter how much small talk I tried to use, I jumped into the meat. "I must admit, I had ulterior motives when I took you in." Her face morphed at my words, but I pressed on. "You are the only ranger pre-level 10 that we have found since our return, and you hold the capability to be a tremendous asset to us. The reason I didn't tell you this before was that I do not wish to force you or pressure you. I wanted you to get comfortable before offering this to you, so you knew you could say no and nothing would happen. We aren't going to kick you out if you decline, so don't worry about that at all. Feel free to do so if you don't want to do what I say, I declared. Watching her face as I spoke, I saw the different emotions she battled through, but the biggest one was surprise. You need me because I'm a weak ranger? She asked curiously. Yes, I need you specifically because you are a ranger who hasn't evolved, I answered. But why? I'm weak, probably the weakest here who has a class. Ranger sucks, and I could barely kill anything before you came around. She vented about her class. I wasn't sure why she felt that way, but it did make things easier. If she wasn't tied to her class, maybe she would slide to a different one with less convincing. I knew some wouldn't. Like me, I loved my warrior class, and I didn't think I would switch if given the chance. You are weak only because you are low level. That will change in time, especially when you get a profession. That had been a surprise to find out. I didn't know why, but I assumed that everyone already had one, even though that wasn't the case. I should have known based on her low level, but it only clicked when she admitted it. But that isn't what's important. I need you because I don't want a ranger. You haven't gone through it yet. But classes can change dramatically during evolutions, and that is the reason I need you. We need the class ranger evolves into, and you are our best bet. We aren't sure of the specifics, but it should be easy enough to accomplish, I said. You need me to not be a ranger? It was hard not to smile at the hope I heard in her voice, like she just now realized I wasn't asking her to be a ranger, but something else entirely, and hoped it was true. Yes, I need you to not be a ranger, I confirmed. I could see her thinking about what was said for a second before she nodded enthusiastically. Okay, I'll do it. I chuckled at how fast she was nodding her head. Slow down there, buckaroo. I haven't even told you what the class is yet. It doesn't matter. Anything is fine as long as it's not ranger. She nearly shouted with joy. All right, you can calm down now. I take it that it's a yes. Both Abigail and I smiled at each other. The class we need is called Beastmaster. You're level 9, so we only have one more skill to work with, but it should work. If you pick up an animal companion skill or a bond skill, it should push you in the right direction. You'll have to put off your evolution for a bit, but we can make this work. Abigail took this chance to jump in. Maybe talk to Hal. His brother explored those skills extensively, and he can help point you in the right direction. I know Kyle was looking to go in this direction. She brought up a good point. We were hoping getting Sarah's level 10 skills to be something like that would add an evolution option towards Beastmaster, but we weren't certain. The plan was to have her stay at level 10 for a while to get comfortable with the skill and experience with handling the companion/bond she picked. None of this was certain, but we felt that gave the best shot at getting what we were looking for. Sarah just nodded along to everything we said, happy that she didn't have to be a ranger anymore. Well, first, let's get you to level 10, I said while getting up. The first floor of the dungeon was the perfect place to get her last level. Chapter 146, First Headache. Getting Sarah's last level was easy enough and didn't end up taking that long. The monsters on the first floor were still low level enough for her to defeat, even if she thought her class was weak. She had been trying to hunt creatures far higher level than her and concluded that she was weak rather than the level gap was too much. Her bow skill was enough to breeze by most of the first floor by herself, even without my interference. She managed to get her last level mostly alone, with me having to step in only once when there was a group of monsters she couldn't take down alone. After hitting level 10, Sarah jumped with joy before I ushered her along to find Hal and get her the last skill. I was thinking a bond skill would be best, but we would ask Hal first before we went through with anything. Even if he didn't look into those skills much, I knew Kyle would have talked his ear off about them, and Hal probably had some residual knowledge kicking around in his head. And it was a good thing too, because he pointed us in a completely different direction than I had originally planned. Bond and companion skills are good, but I don't think that's the direction you want to go in. You're trying to make her into Kathy, right? Hal asked. Yes. Then I think taking Soothe is a better option. It builds up to Tame skills and is a better path toward Beastmaster. Bond and companion skills could still lead to hundreds of different classes, but Soothe puts her on a direct path toward Beastmaster. He explained. Soothe worked to calm wild animals and made the taming process quicker and easier. It led directly into tame skills and increased their effectiveness. The reason I hadn't considered it was because it didn't directly do anything for taming. By itself, it only calmed whatever you wanted soothed. It could work on humans to a lesser degree, but any kind of mental defense was enough to brush off the weak skill. It wasn't meant for mind control. What he said made sense and made me wonder what skill Kathy took to get where she did. It would have made things so much easier if she had just told us. I felt Hal's idea held more weight than my original plan and had Sarah take what he had said. Soothe didn't seem to do much on its own, but I trusted it would get us where we wanted to go. There wasn't a restriction when ranking up to G rank, so Sarah could have gone ahead and done it, but that would have killed the plan in its infancy. We would take a few days to get her used to the skill and some experience using it before we even considered ranking up. None of us were sure if the offered list of 5 could change or not yet. Every time someone ranked up, they chose one of the offered 5. When we asked, no one in the caravan had delayed after seeing the list either. It should be possible, but we didn't know for sure. Why would you be allowed to delay the choice if the options couldn't change? That seemed counterintuitive for that to be an option if that was the case. While Sarah spent a few days practicing Soothe on wild animals, the rest of us began to pack up. We ended up spending a week at the dungeon, and everyone got more than enough time to run through it. Our crafters were especially happy with all the different materials coming out of the dungeon. They were gluttons for choice when making things now rather than the other way around. One thing I hadn't realized when the material started coming out was the crafts that couldn't be made from them. Most in our company already had weapons and armor from the tutorial, but some didn't, or they were in need of replacing, but some things weren't able to be made. Anything metal was fine. Swords, spears, even great swords were being sharpened and polished for use. The dungeon had given plenty of the stuff for crafts, but leather was harder. The squares the dungeon offered were a few feet wide and tall, which only covered the front of my torso before the material ran out. To make a full chest piece or leggings, it would take multiple of the squares sewn together. While that didn't sound like a problem, and we were pulling a decent amount of leather out of the dungeon, the problem was the leather was all different. Every square came from a different animal, had a different affinity, different toughness and durability. It was hard enough to find enough of the same affinity to use, let alone the same animal. The variation made making anything large difficult. There wasn't enough of the same leather to combine together into something useful. Wearing the lesser gear we had now was better than the mishmash the crafters could put together with the pieces we had. If we had stayed longer, that wouldn't have been a problem. We would have continued to pull out material and matching pieces would come around. But none of us knew how long that would take, and I wasn't willing to stay to find out. The pieces got bigger depending on the floor they were pulled out on, but that was still too little for complete pieces. It was easier to wait until we found the material elsewhere. After a week of staying in the same spot, we were on the road again. Well, it wasn't a road, but the sentiment was the same. The strengthened carts held up better to travel, and we were able to make it further than before and keep a faster pace. The added levels everyone had also helped. People had more strength, and pulling the carts was easier than before. The added weight of the new materials offset that somewhat, but we were faster overall. One thing I hadn't anticipated about our stop was I had to come up with a policy regarding money. Most had gotten at least a coin or two inside the dungeon, and they were unsure if they were able to keep it. Our caravan was made up of people from multiple different tutorials, but leaders like Tracy were common in most. People who took control of everything that came into people's possession. People were talking about it, and we needed to come up with our policy regarding it. It was something I hadn't thought of yet, as I expected to have more time. I tossed the problem around within our council, but we weren't able to come to a consensus. Speaking of our council, it had grown since our return. Or stayed the same size based on how you looked at it. In the tutorial, it consisted of me, Austin, Abigail, Hal, Sam, and my father. The 6 of us worked out ideas and plans for what we were going to do. That number was cut down to 5 when the tutorial ended, but my mother was added after our return, bringing us back to 6. I offered it to Gabriel, but he didn't want to be a part of it. He felt it was a waste of time and didn't care either way. Some of the 6 wanted to keep the same ratio as before when we were earning points rather than coins, a 50-50 split. Others wanted more, some less, but no plan had a majority to it. I was thinking farther ahead into the future with it and wanted to make it the same as what our tax rate on dungeons would be after we created the city. It would set it now so we wouldn't have to change it after we arrived. Knowing that we weren't just setting a temporary rate for the caravan, but the future rate made the discussion more adamant rather than less. 50% seems fair to me. We give them shelter and security while they still get to keep half of what they make. Anything less is not enough. Where in the world had a 50% tax rate? That's straight extortion at that point. No one will want to live in a city that takes half what they make. What then? 10%? That's certainly not enough. It was a balancing act where everyone fell on different parts of the line. Thinking of all the things this decision would affect only made it harder. If we set it too high, no one would want to live in my city. Too low, and we wouldn't have enough money to run the city. How about an even quarter? 25% seems like a good compromise. That still seems high to me, though. We had been going around in circles trying to come up with a rate, and it was beginning to give me a headache. This would be so much easier if we knew what other cities were doing. If we knew what others did, we would be able to go based on theirs. But we didn't, and it made coming up with one all that much harder. Why don't we think about it differently? I broke into the conversation. How much would you be willing to give up as you leave a dungeon? Say you live in a city and you delve into the dungeon for a living, and as you exit you have to give up an amount. How much of what you earned would you be okay with giving up and continue to live there? Everyone quieted to contemplate their answer while I did the same. If my livelihood depended on making money through clearing dungeons, how much would I be all right with giving up? My immediate answer was 0, but that was unfeasible. If someone owned the dungeon, they would want something out of letting me into it. My next answer was as low as possible, but that didn't help either. I was the dungeon owner in this scenario, and as low as possible wasn't an actual rate. 1 in 10? 1 in 5? Giving up 1 coin in 10 didn't sound too bad. It didn't give the same knee-jerk reaction as 1 in 2. 1 in 5 was pushing it for me personally, but it might be doable if it was a particularly good dungeon. Like one that gave out expensive loot as a reward. The fact my feeling was conditional based on the dungeon made everything harder. Anything higher than 33% is pushing it for me. Hal started the conversation again. Yeah, I was thinking closer to what Sam said before, 25% Austin mentioned. Abigail seemed pained to admit it, but chimed in saying 20%. She was the one pushing for the higher percentage, but I had a feeling it was because she was the one using it. She knew how hard it was going to be to run the city and wanted as much cushion as possible, even if 50% was entirely too much. Both Sam and my mother came in at the lower end. One said 10% while the other 15%. Sam drastically lowered her position after thinking about what she would be willing to give up. It was funny to see how it gradually got lower, but that still didn't help us decide. It seems like the average is around 20%. I say we start there as a base and adjust it accordingly. Things may change that rate, but 1 in 5 seems like a good starting point. I concluded to everyone's nod. While that sounds fine for dungeon tax, what about a city tax? Sam brought up, people choose whether or not to go into a dungeon, but what about the people just trying to make a living elsewhere, like farmers or crafters? Ah geez, that was going to make this conversation way longer than I wanted it to be. We can figure that out later. We are still months away from even reaching the place we are going to build, and that doesn't need to be decided now. Plus, we will get to see what others do while we travel, and we can get a baseline based on that. I said. Everyone was all right with that answer and seemed fine shelving that for later. The next step was to announce it to the caravan. People grumbled and badgered, but ultimately seemed okay with what we had come up with. It helped we were only taxing the coins right now as the material was needed by everybody. Equipping everyone in decent gear was what came first, and we could decide on a sales tax after everyone was at least geared. Plus, we weren't really in a state we could do that. Everyone was helping everyone right now, and that wasn't something we could afford to break up. We could maintain what we were doing for a while, and it would only cause problems when our population grew too large, and we would change things by then. Technically, It was my first official headache as a leader, and I thought it went over all right, but it didn't leave me feeling good inside as I laid in bed that night. All I could think of was the future issues that would pop up, and we only made it through one today. Just thinking of all the things we would need to decide made me shudder. It was times like these when I questioned my decision to make a city. No, Christopher. Think of the castle. Chapter 147, Wild Speaker. What's a copper coin even worth? Vinny asked. We were on the road again, and his cart jostled along next to mine as we walked. The wheels thumped and rattled behind him, and the cart had significant changes made to it during our stop and grew to even larger than the one I pulled. He made the whole thing fold out into a temporary forge so he could have a better workspace than what he was dealing with, making it a forge on wheels almost. It still wasn't enough to handle the spirit fire he had purchased, but it was way better than the makeshift workspace from before. Without anything else to do during our travel, we mostly talked about random things or just watched nature go by. Ever since we earned our first coin of the new currency, that was the talk of most of the caravan. We knew it was money, but not what it was worth. I've got no idea. I assume it's like a penny or something since it's the lowest denomination. I responded. But think about what you did to earn that. You went and fought deadly monsters inside of a dungeon and were rewarded only a few coins? Imagine if you weren't higher level than the monsters and had to fight them at level. Vinny pondered. Plus, how many total did you get from the entire dungeon? He brought up good points, and it made me think about it deeper. Austin and I walked out with 44 total, but if we were a party, we would split that, so 22 each for the whole thing. I counted out. Yeah, but a party would have more people, so split it 5 ways instead of 2, and each person would make under 10 coins. Vinny pointed out. It was more than that though. We came out with other loot than only coins. The materials are worth something as well, I added. True, but there are other expenses as well if we're getting technical. I had to resharpen swords, bend shields back into place, service armor and gear. That would usually carry a cost along with it. Add in the fact you took some of what they made as well, he said. Hey, don't make me sound like the bad guy. Taxes are a part of life. I defended. That wasn't my point. It's just that they went and risked life and limb and only came out with a few coins, so they have to be worth something more than pennies. Vinny said. The cart ambled on behind me as I thought about what he said as we transitioned back to silence. There was a nuance there that hadn't appeared the first time I had given it thought. I had been distracted by the new experience of a dungeon and earning loot like a video game and never delved into the nitty-gritty of how that was going to work in the long term. Assuming people had to make a living delving into them, then what they pulled out of the dungeon had to be a livable wage. So, if they made around 10 coins a day, then that had to be enough to survive on. One would assume. In reality, it was less than that a day. Weapons and armor would cost money, as well as repairs and upgrades. Potions for healing or curing diseases. Paying for an actual healer when potions weren't enough. Materials or facilities if they wanted to do body refining or anything else for the other paths would also cost money. That wasn't even mentioning buying skills or getting your gear enchanted. Those were all expenses on top of what it took to live. Food and shelter being the main two. It all hinted at a larger nuanced economy, but that quickly blew up in proportion. Trying to extrapolate what someone earned from a dungeon into guessing how much things would cost was an exercise in futility. I didn't have the knowledge or expertise in order to do so. Maybe some economist might be able to do so, but that wasn't me. All it gave me was another headache. Now I wasn't sure if our 500 coin treasury was good or not after thinking like that. I had been feeling good over the amount before this conversation. Why are you even thinking about this? We won't even know their worth until we find our first pylon anyway, and that won't happen for a while yet. I asked curiously. While looking over the map and the path we were on, we tried to predict where we would find pockets of civilization. Other than the 2 guilds duking it out back home, we had yet to find any large groups of people or camps. We found groups occasionally, but most of the ruined towns we passed were empty. There was the occasional larger group, but that hadn't happened for a while. It had been almost a month since our return, and most had moved on and found other places to stay quickly. Any who lived on the outskirts of cities were the first to leave and find safer places to stay, and those were the areas we traveled through. It was hard to remember that not everyone could wade through the forest like we could. There was a sprinkling of ear-ranked beasts we found, and that would be more than most could handle. There were definitely some who could do what we were doing, or a large enough group of people, but I put that in the vast minority of those who returned. Just looking over the people who joined our caravan, the average level was in the low 30s. People that level would see the wilderness as a death sentence and would want to leave as quickly as possible before they ran across an animal they couldn't handle. Especially the areas we were traveling through. That was the reason we predicted our first run-in with civilization was going to be the bigger cities. If we kept our current path, we would eventually run into where Indianapolis once stood, and the chances of a pylon being planted there were high. Nothing else to do really, plus it helps me plan what I will charge for my services. If I know an adventurer only earns a few coins a day, I can't very well charge thousands for a basic sword I make. Vinny's words pulled me out of my train of thought and brought me back to the question I had asked. You're already thinking that far ahead? Wait a minute. When did we start calling them adventurers? I questioned. Vinny had a sheepish look on his face at my inquiry. I mean, what else do you want to call people who delve dungeons for a living? Haha. I couldn't help but laugh at that. Real-life adventurers, who would have thought? My laughter died off as something came to mind again, and I turned to Vinny with a serious face. Why the hell am I the one hauling your heavy-ass anvil? Vinny's laugh choked off before looking around with his eyes. I have no idea what you're talking about. Would you look at that? Luke needs me somewhere other than here. I watched as Vinny accelerated off with his cart bouncing behind him, and I couldn't help but shake my head and sigh. Our line of carts weaved this way and that across the land as we traveled northwest. Our trip was rather mundane compared to what some parts of the rest of the world were experiencing, no doubt. It was hard to look at the map we had and see the illuminating deep color in some areas without knowing the challenge that came with it. The coloring of mana density so high that even I would have trouble with the things who lived there. Some would make it like we had, but others wouldn't. It was different to know that feeling and what those people were going through. We could do nothing about it, though. The only thing we could do was note it down and continue on our way. Continue through the paces knowing that there were places in the world where people were dying. It was an odd thing to internalize. Odd to work through and set it aside in your head. I blamed the old news for making that process easier. Without it, knowing would have been harder had we not been inundated with the experience before. Still, our trip had its challenges. We went through our first rough patch not long after we left the dungeon. People must have forgotten the consequences of what would happen. What I said was going to happen. Our first thieves popped up and everyone found out firsthand that I was a man of my word. They must have seen the new goods floating around from the dungeon and gotten too full of themselves. Whether it was greed or envy, it mattered little to me. The law was broken and I had my part to play out, no matter how barbaric people may think of it. Evidence was presented against them, witnesses were questioned, and they were found guilty. Finding the stolen goods in their possession made the process smoother, but I made everyone go through the entire process. If nothing else but to practice for when it happened again. There was little doubt that it would happen again. It was as inevitable as the rain, it was just human nature. There wasn't a need to do it publicly, but neither did I try to hide it. If people wanted to see, then they were welcome to, but I also wasn't going to turn it into a spectacle. My ice took a few more hands that day. Some, thinking that I wasn't serious about the punishments, didn't take it well and left. Either against the bloodshed or the barbaric punishments, they packed up what they had and didn't continue with us. It wasn't the first time that people had done so, but it was the first in such a public manner. People had slinked off in the night before due to second thoughts or a change of mind since the first night. It wasn't surprising to see more do it now. I didn't pay those people any mind. I wasn't forcing anyone to stay, and I bid them farewell. I assumed some would also remain behind after we found a stable city, unwilling to travel through the wilderness alone, and would only stay with us until we reached one. But that didn't matter much either. It was their prerogative to do so. While I let the healers close the wound, I barred them from regrowing the limb. I knew Gabriel's legs were in the process of being regrown, and I didn't want that to happen just yet. It would defeat the purpose of the punishment. I wouldn't bar them from doing so forever, just for a while so they could realize the weight of their actions. If they regrew the hand in a day or two, it would be easy to forget and do it again. The morale of the caravan fell after that. The high of leveling and receiving loot from the dungeon was thoroughly wiped out, but there was nothing I could do about that. Actions had consequences, and I wasn't going to run a lawless city. It took a few days for the cheeriness to work its way back into our group, but it eventually did. Laughs came back along with jokes. The people involved didn't partake, but others did. It was almost a relief when the monotony of our travels came back rather than the uncomfortable atmosphere it had been. One high note came a few days later when Sarah continued to gain experience with Soothe, and I felt that she was ready to take the next step. She vibrated in excitement when I finally gave her the go-ahead to evolve out of her ranger class. Her evolution revealed a few things, and I couldn't have been happier about them. After hearing Sarah relay her options, I was almost vibrating more than she was. Austin comparing me to a little girl put a swift end to it externally, but I still felt it inside. Her troubles and fight for survival were enough for her to be offered an uncommon class along with revealing her affinity, which was nature. Hearing of her nature affinity made me picture Christian, but I quickly pushed those feelings down and I focused on the classes she was offered. One of the options sounded perfect for what we were going for and was the one she ended up choosing. Wild Speaker strengthened her connection with the wilderness and wild animals, which was the perfect path for what I needed her to turn into. The fact she seemed to like it was a perfect bonus. I was unsure if it would evolve into Beastmaster specifically, but it sounded like it would fulfill the same purpose either way. As long as she continued down this path, we would maybe have something better than a Beastmaster. After her evolution, I had her take a more active role in fighting the beasts we came across. She traveled with Jonathan out on training trips away from the caravan, and her level steadily rose. It would be a while before she reached F rank, but she was well on her way. Other than helping Sarah, there wasn't much for me to do. None of the monsters around were high enough level to fight, and that only left sparring and training. Austin and I had sparred so many times we were able to predict what the other was going to do by now. It became less of a fight and more of just going through the motions. My training with Gabriel was my most anticipated time of the day. It was always fun to heighten my control over my element. It helped that it was the only thing that felt like I was progressing. My levels weren't going up and neither were my stats, but I was getting better at controlling my ice and using it in different ways. Speaking of Gabriel, the regrowing process took a huge leap after our long stop at the dungeon. Both of us worked together to enchant a formation to aid the process. We laid it out on the cart he was traveling on most of the time. It focused the healing better and accelerated the process, but it wasn't anything miraculous. Both our abilities were lacking, but we did what we could. We still weren't sure how long it would take, but estimates put them fully regrown in another month or two. It was upsetting that I couldn't create anything more, but I did the best I could with what I had available. The books I bought from the store about formations came along with some basic runes that I was able to use, and that was it. They didn't have every rune out there, and I didn't have a large repository of runes to pull from, which made what I could put together limited. It was lucky that one of them was a basic healing rune. Even if it wasn't the best, it was better than nothing. After Sarah and the update with my brother, it felt like everything was coming up heads for us. Even if there was a small bump in the road before. Chapter 148 Warriors. Nick. Point of view. A month had passed since Nick planted his pylon, and he could hardly believe the difference. Where the area was once full of ruined houses and derelict roads, there now stood real houses and a palisade wrapping around them, keeping them safe. They were barely better than wooden huts, and some were basically shacks, but that didn't take away from the accomplishment he felt. It was a far cry from the once modern city blocks, but it was a luxury to most that made their way here from outside. They looked at the wooden huts in envy and relief after their time spent in the wild. Stories of having to sleep on the ground every night and having to stalk through the woods to hunt and forage for food were abundant when new arrivals showed up. The food part stayed the same, but it didn't require a whole town's effort to partake in. Rangers that evolved into hunters could bring in far more meat than amateur civilians or other classes. So could profession-focused foragers or anyone of similar professions. Long-term food efforts were beginning as well, with a few farmers his second managed to find in the masses. It was a bit late to plant now, but skills could make up for the time lost. The extra mana causing them to grow faster. After building the first structures of his new city, They moved on to planning ahead. There was still the constant threat of monsters, but they were prepared and experienced for that. The gashes and scratches in their palisade could attest to their experience and new levels throughout the camp as well. Nick wasn't even personally needed most of the time, and he was the strongest man in the camp. The only downside that he felt so far was the constant need for management. Everything needed his decision on placement, what people should work on first and who should do what. Plus, after claiming the outpost, as the system called it, he had the chance to set a tax rate. Everything was way above him, and the constant need for his time was beginning to frustrate him. Nick didn't care about most of the stuff, which made it feel like a waste of time to slog through. His dream was to rule a city, he didn't want to run one. Which was why recruiting his outpost chief had been such a game-changer for him. She had been wonderful at dealing with all the nitty-gritty while he got to watch from afar instead of having to do everything himself. Her tutorial had been way different than his, and she was already experienced with being in charge of a pylon. Her expertise in the matter made everything that much easier and allowed Nick to focus on other things. He felt like his law was getting close to upgrading, and he could feel he was close. It helped that the dungeon next to them gave him ample experience to fight and grow in levels. It was hard not to think further into the future. Nick knew that not everything would continue to run smoothly like it had, but if he had already done this much in only a month, how much further could he go? He still only had the one pylon, and he had heard that owning more was possible. Nick's tutorial didn't have any pylons or anything close to it. His focus on fighting in dungeons and all of the pylon information was completely new to him, but he couldn't help but feel excited about what he heard. After hearing more were a possibility, he couldn't stop his fantasies from building. What if he could build a kingdom? What about an empire? Gabriel. Point of view. The constant rattling of the cart was enough to drive him mad, but there was nothing he could do about it. He couldn't very well walk, and the cart was the only option he had for transportation. Ever since his legs were lost, he had tried to not wallow in despair, but there were times when it was hard. Bumping around in the cart was one of those times. He tried to keep up a happy face so the others around him didn't look at him with pity, but the bumps and aching was making it difficult. Those looks hurt more than when he lost his legs. It was like they were looking at someone who was useless, who couldn't do anything for himself and needed to be weighted on hand and foot. It was the reason he tried so hard to show people that he wasn't as helpless as they assumed. If this had been before, and there wasn't magic to explore or keep his mind off of it, it would have been miserable. Then again, he wouldn't have lost his legs to a monster if that was the case, but that wasn't the point. The arcane was wonderful. It was everything he could have imagined, and then some. All the games and books he had played or read didn't even hold a candle to doing it in real life. From the first skill he picked to his newest, all of them were a wonder to behold. To be able to affect the world with his mind was a feeling he would never get over. Still, one of his greatest challenges right now was trying to walk with his mind, and that was proving harder than he thought. He knew how to walk, but it was different than sending commands to his muscles. The line of carts slowed to a stop, which finally ended the incessant rattling. He wasn't sure why they stopped this time, but it didn't much matter. He pulled himself off the cart and into his chair before finding a nice place to practice away from prying eyes. His legs and bottom hurt from constantly sitting, but the ache was familiar by now. Legs were hard. He had to move the ice in a particular way while keeping his balance without affecting his other leg, and 1,000 smaller things that would send him tumbling to the ground. It was a true test of his skills, and he was failing. After yet another tumble to the ground, Christopher's voice cut in from behind him that he hadn't known was there. "You don't have to continue this. Your legs are coming back, and it won't be long until you can walk again." He turned to see Chris leaning up against a tree with his arms crossed as he watched Gabriel practice. The hammer commonly with him nowhere in sight. Gabriel knew that what he was doing was hard for him to watch, but Chris always found the time to accompany him. He had never been good at keeping his emotions off his face, and Gabriel caught him cringe when he fell or his face tightened when he took a bad spill. The instant reaction to reach out and catch him and having to forcibly restrain himself from doing so. While he appreciated the support, it was easier to practice without him here. "No, I will get this," Gabriel said with determination as he pulled himself up off the ground. It was what he spent most of his time doing, and he wasn't going to give up now. Even if he knew that his legs would come back, he wanted to walk now. Not in months after the healers were done with him. He wanted to stop feeling useless. Needed it almost. He attempted a few more tries with his new watcher and they all ended the same. Every time he would pick himself up and go again. He made it a few more steps this time before he ended up back on the ground. He tried not to get frustrated since Chris was here, but some of it got out regardless. What did surprise him, though, was the sharp laughter that erupted from behind him. His head whipped around to see Chris laughing while wiping at his eyes. "What are you laughing at?" His question came out harsher than intended, but he couldn't help but feel hurt at being laughed at. Chris quieted down before explaining, "I'm not laughing at you, bud. But think about this from a different perspective. You are using your mind to control ice in the form of legs trying to walk. Looking at this from the outside is kinda crazy." He let out a chuckle himself when it was put that way. It was so easy to forget where they came from. To get so focused on the problems of now instead of looking back and witnessing where they had started. Even with the hitch of what happened, he had come far and it was easy to forget that. Even if his icy legs were a constant struggle for him. A more somber note rang out in his head from what Chris said, and he couldn't help but see the parallels. His father would have said the same thing. How you choose to look at something is almost more important than what you're looking at. His father would have put it better, but what Chris said held the same meaning. It was also nice to have his brother back again. He didn't mean back physically. Chris had been with them for over a month now, but back to almost his old self. Or what was left of it. When Chris first came and found them, he had been full of tension. Wounds so tight that nothing from who he once was got out. His eyes were always looking ahead to the next fight rather than the here and now. Partially with them while somewhere else in his head. It was nice to see him lose some of that tension as they traveled. Gabriel got to watch as it fell off with every step they took. Chris didn't like to tell any stories from his tutorial, but they were easy enough to get from the others. Austin especially. Gabriel didn't have the same bond with his cousin as Chris, but it was always easy to get a story out of him. He had to work through and decipher the embellishing Austin put on his stories, but the base information was always true, no matter how outlandish it sounded. Gabriel thought it was Chris's distaste for lying that made Austin rein it in with his exaggerations. The two rubbed off on each other, as much as the two would deny it. Even knowing it was exaggerated, he knew some of it was true from other stories, like how they single-handedly charged through a gate and defeated a whole camp of thralls. That one had been a crazy one to listen to, and he had called Austin out at multiple points of the story, but it had all turned out true. "You know you will probably have to go through this at some point as well. Do I get to laugh at you then?" Gabriel snarked back. Chris sported a smile and covered it with a joke. "Are you wishing harm on your brother? And here I thought we cared for one another." "Oh, come on. That wasn't what I meant," he responded. "Just with all the fighting you do, you are bound to lose something at one point. Statistics demand it almost." Gabriel watched as the tightness crept back on his face. As he went to brush off his comment and change the subject to something else after his joke hadn't worked. It was what he always did when him getting injured came up. That or when anything dangerous came up. It was like he was allergic to having other people worry. "My fortitude is high and my skills are strong. My armor as well." Chris started, but Gabriel cut him off. He wasn't going to let him brush it aside this time. "Christopher," Gabriel said in a serious tone, "I'm not going to baby you like the other two will. You may say your fortitude is high and you are strong. I'm not claiming otherwise, but don't fool yourself. Don't forget, I can feel your aura and I understand your confidence. But saying it will never happen is both arrogant and stupid. You know better than most that anything can happen in a fight. Frankly, you're lucky it hasn't happened already. Given your current path, you will eventually be in the same state I am, and it's better to be prepared for that now." He watched as Chris puffed up to wave away his concerns but stopped himself before going through with it, and visibly deflated instead. "I know. Gabe," he sighed. "I don't think it will never happen, but how do you think Abigail or Mom would react if they saw me practicing, just in case I lose an arm in the future? Or a leg? Oh, they would give you a long lecture on how to face risks, but that isn't the point. Both of them are warriors. They were born that way and they can't help it, but that doesn't mean you should let it affect you. You can't let how they will react stop you from doing something you need to do. I had enough of that during the tutorial when Mom tried to stop me from going into the dungeon. I admit that specific example ended poorly, but you can't let them dictate what you can and cannot do. Gabriel said. You're right, Gabe, Chris said softly. But it's hard for me to do that. Our tutorial was rough. Everyone is still working through issues, and I don't want to add to that. I know I can't limit myself because of them, but I also don't want to add to their struggles unnecessarily. Especially now, when people are just starting to heal. The clearing they were in found its way back into silence as both just sat next to each other. Gabriel knew pushing too hard right now wouldn't accomplish anything, and it wasn't an issue that needed it. He was glad to have this conversation now, but he also wanted Chris to add himself into that group of everyone. He talked about everyone healing like he wasn't included in that. Like he was fine and it was everyone else who was going through it, even though he was there in the same boat. Still, Gabriel took what he could get and focused back on trying to walk. If you're going to stand there and watch, at least give it a try to find out how hard this is. It's not as easy as it looks, damn it. Gabe pestered. Fine, I'll give it a go. Watch how the master does it. Chris laughed before building ice over his lower body. Gabriel had to admit he was getting a lot better at that. The ice froze around his legs quickly and efficiently, and Gabe could tell he had been practicing. His skill when they first started training was abysmal. He had let a skill do it for too long and had to work out that bad habit before they could start building new ones. It was a nice change of pace to watch Chris fall flat on his face instead of doing it himself. Chris's admission of it being harder than it looked only made it better. Chapter 149, A City. Chris. Point of view. So this is it. A city. Austin's voice sounded out from next to me. Our caravan had crested the grassy hill we stood upon and were given a clear sight of the city in the distance. Or, more accurately, what was left of it. What met our eye was ruined concrete and rubble. Buildings any taller than a few stories laid on their side or destroyed completely. Any and all glass had long ago shattered. Buildings of brick held up the best. But even those were scattered and strewn from forces long past. Bricks strewn about from where they once collapsed. It seemed the terraforming had its way with what was once a large city. Indianapolis wasn't the largest city in the world, but it was still a large one. We had traveled through mostly forest and outskirts to get here, and we were coming upon the first large metropolis area, and to see it in such a state. It was jarring. It showed the extent to which the world had changed. No more structures were jutting into the air, claiming the skyline, as any building that dared now lay crumbled upon itself. Picturing New York made me sigh and shake my head. I had never been to the city, and now I would never get to see it as it was. I was in no great rush to do so, but now it wasn't even an option. Let alone any of the famous cities around the world. The Eiffel Tower probably wasn't standing anymore. The odd thing about looking upon such destruction was knowing that no one had perished. Usually, such scenes came with a death toll that colored your vision when you looked upon them. It added a somberness that this was missing. We knew that no one was in the city when it happened, and the knowledge that no one had died during the destruction made it feel lesser almost. As more carts rolled over the hill, more of us began to stop and stare at what lay ahead. Most felt similar to me when taking in the destruction, but excitement quickly shot through the camp at the sight. There were people. How many people do you think are down there? I asked. At the distance we were at, it was difficult for me to make out the details. I could see movement, but I couldn't tell anything of greater detail. Thousands from what I can see, probably more, Austin said as he glowed for a brief moment, calling on his bloodline to see further. Even if only half the city survived, that put a few 100,000 down there. It was hard to imagine that many people lived among the ruins. There's an area of new construction on the western side of the city. Mostly wood, but there's a palisade surrounding it. Hal chimed in from my right. Where Austin had his bloodline to see further, Hal had skills to do the same. The only one among us who couldn't see anything was me. My eyesight had greatly improved thanks to the points in perception, but it was nowhere near good enough to see in the detail they were, especially for something so far away. Do you think it's a pylon? I asked curiously. Without a doubt. There isn't one visible, but there's one down there, I'm sure of it. The borders are too clean to not follow some kind of guide like the area that gets claimed. Hal answered, "How does it look? Are people struggling? Do they look despondent or ragged?" I questioned. We were still about an hour away from arriving at the city, but I wanted to get as much information as I could. If the people looked like they were struggling, then I needed to prepare myself accordingly. The state of the people spoke to what kind of person took up leadership after arriving back on Earth. Having a base amount of strength and levels to back it up was a given. You had to have that much to even purchase a pylon. Not everyone was given the opportunity to buy one at the end of the tutorial, but that didn't say anything of the character of the person leading. Plus, I knew they made it through at least one wave of monsters when they planted the pylon and claimed the land. Still, that didn't mean much. There was a wide range of possibilities when it came to fighting a wave, as our tutorial could attest. It had been over a month since our return. They could have built the palisade first and then claimed the land for all I knew. That would have lessened the strength needed to defeat the wave along with other defenses that could have been built. Hal and Austin both didn't see anything else in the defenses department, but that didn't mean they weren't there. They could be hidden or been destroyed during the wave. The amount of people down there also could have been the reason they defeated the wave. A few thousand could have handled the early levels of pylons with enough ease, and there were more than enough down there to do so, even if they were all under-leveled. All of that ran through my head as we overlooked the city. They look fine from what I can tell. Most are working on more buildings, but there is a steady line of people leading off into the distance. Austin answered with an accompanying point. Which direction are they headed in? Northeast. Unrolling the map and holding it out for all of us to see revealed the reason. After hitting more landmarks and getting better at reading the topography, we were able to pinpoint our location with greater accuracy. After leaving the dungeon, it was easy to track where we were on the map as we traveled. Having that higher degree of accuracy, we were able to locate the dungeon off to the northeast that they were likely heading off to. We stood and chatted about a few other things, but it didn't amount to all that much. There was only so much we could decipher from here, and we would only know the situation once we got there. Joining back up and hauling my cart to catch up, we traveled on. We were a large group of people just shy of 100 strong, which made us easily spotted not long after we descended the hill. Scouts who were looking out for monsters easily picked up on our presence. I took it as a good sign that they didn't seem to be surprised at our appearance. They had probably dealt with refugees over the past month, and we were just another group coming into the city. Nothing out of the usual happened as we approached, but one thing did occur as we reached the gate. The gate was manned by a trio of what I assumed were guards. We were still a bit early into the transition for my mind to immediately think of gate guards rather than bouncers, but that was slowly changing. 1 copper per person to enter the gate, and the carts stay outside. The man standing in front of the gate said, with the 2 others backing him up. For some reason, I hadn't expected there to be a fee to enter the city. In hindsight, that should have been something I expected, but I was still caught off guard. Another thing it brought up was not all of us could enter. If the carts couldn't enter, people would need to stay with them and keep watch. I didn't expect this to be a city of thieves, but leaving them in the open was just asking to come back to them gone. We had already had a run-in with theft, and that was within the caravan. Hal, do you and Rachel mind staying with the caravan? I asked. Both gave a nod, and that problem was dealt with. The next one was forking over the coins for all of us. The guards didn't feel very strong, and I could have just barged in without paying, but that wasn't a very good introduction. I wasn't out to act a fool, and neither did I want it known I behaved that way. It was dishonorable. The only reason I felt that would be justifiable would be if the fee had been outrageously high, but even then we didn't need to get into the city. It was just a nice place to stop for a while and restock. There was a hope to sleep on actual beds, but that didn't seem likely. With the amount of people that milled about compared to the number of permanent structures, there weren't going to be beds for us to sleep in. I had a thought to pay for the whole caravan but dismissed it. With our time spent at the dungeon, everyone had their own coins to spend. Even Sarah had made a few on the first level of the dungeon, and she was the lowest level in the caravan. Plus, it wasn't like they needed to enter the city. If they wanted to, they could pay for it themselves. Abigail walked over and paid for most of the family from our grouped funds, and the guard actually counted them out. It added to the time it took and was slightly frustrating, but we waited to be waved in before we entered. Without the cart, the only thing in my possession was my hammer, and I expected some kind of restriction as I walked in about it, but it never came. Everyone outside of the walls ambled around with some kind of weapon strapped to them, which made them common, but a part of me still expected to be told that I couldn't bring them in. I was glad that didn't happen, as that was a bigger issue than paying the coin to enter. I wasn't going to let anyone make me remove my weapon. It wasn't like I needed my hammer. I could easily make another with the practice I had put into making ice, but it was the principle of the matter. I wasn't going to let anyone deprive me of my weapon. Luckily, there were no other restrictions and we were allowed entry into the city. It was hard not to put mental air quotes around city, because it was a far cry from a real one. The houses looked solidly built, but they were few in number. Other than those, not a lot of buildings occupied the area. As densely populated as we predicted the area to be, there weren't a lot of structures to be had. Other than their number being few, the construction looked well in hand. What had been built looked sturdy and orderly. The placement wasn't haphazard or undirected. Stakes in the ground with different colored ribbons demarked one area from another as people placed materials here and there. I didn't know what the colors meant, but it was easy to tell that someone had a hand in planning this. We had seen the logging effort going on as we neared the city, and there was a constant stream of logs and other materials entering the city to aid in construction. What surprised me was there weren't any stones traveling about. The camp had so far been made of logs hewed into planks instead of the stone I somewhat expected. What little there was flowed up from the earth by dedicated earth mages. As we shuffled through the marked-off streets, we got a look at the reason there wasn't stone anywhere else. As the center of the camp, blocked from view initially, stood a large keep under construction. It looked similar to the ones from our tutorial in size, and it seemed to be the inner area of the city. It wasn't hard to locate where to find the resident lord and the reason there wasn't stone anywhere else. Our pace slowed as we took in the sights, and it was hard not to stare at what was happening around us. We had done this ourselves during the tutorial, but it was different seeing it on this level. Everywhere, people labored on this or that. Saws and hatchets broke logs into planks. Chisels and hammers carved the planks into shape before others hauled them off to where they were needed. The construction effort was strong and skills flashed abound. The numerous builders raising buildings so fast progress was visible to the naked eye. If we had been a month later, it seemed like the city would be filled rather than the sparse collection it was now. "All right," Abigail's voice pulled me away from watching people work. "We need to find a merchant around here, get some food and supplies, maybe check out if they have anything else for sale. I don't expect much, but it can't hurt to look." When the city first came into sight, we had aimed toward it subconsciously. It wasn't until someone asked the question that we realized we didn't have a specific reason to enter it. We had most of the supplies we needed already in the carts, and we had foraged for everything else. Hal and a few other rangers were good hunters, and our food supply was steady, so it wasn't like we were low. Curiosity was what drove most of us, but there was also the practical reason. We had no way of knowing what was inside the city without entering ourselves. There was bound to be something we needed to pick up that was available, and if nothing else, it was a learning experience in how people ran cities now that the world changed. Still, as we walked, it was hard not to feel a sense of familiarity with what I was seeing. Almost like déjà vu. Chapter 150 Lunch? Hendrix. Point of view. The manna in the air was so thick he could almost taste it. The thickness clogged his throat and made him struggle to bring air into his lungs. There was a suffocating weight it held, turning the air into a viscosity he had to fight through. The area had transformed into one of the highest concentrations of mana in the world, and they had returned right in the middle of it. Ever since they had been returned, fighting for their lives had taken up every second of every day. Even months after, they were still clawing and struggling to eke out a place to live. It felt like fate was playing tricks on them as they barely had a chance to rest. Monsters seemed endless and multiplied faster than they could cut them down. People fell daily trying to hold the line. There were even some they couldn't cut down, and retreat was the only option. If this was a joke, Hendrix wasn't laughing. Transporting them into a tutorial to get them used to the new world for a nice few months, and then throw them into the deep end in an area with mana so thick it hurt to breathe. Gonzalez! How much longer till impact? He screamed over the sound of battle. The wrappings on his mace were running low and he only had a few left. Same for his shield. The walking horrors ambled this way and that, their grotesque limbs swaying as they walked, only to whip out unexpectedly at the nearest person when they stepped in range. Their gray skin was slick with a liquid slime that made it look even worse as it shimmered in the dull gloom of the area. Even the sun had to fight for control here, and the celestial body was struggling against the environment, let alone humanity. If that wasn't enough, the liquid covering their form was highly corrosive. Could eat through metal, leather, and bone in seconds. No matter what their weapons were made from, they would quickly deteriorate after the first few strikes. His sword found itself quickly melted to goop during his first fight with them. He had learned from that first day, and now his group hefted maces and clubs wrapped in various cloth and leather. The wrappings would both soak up the liquid and peel off before the weapons started eroding, keeping the weapons intact while also removing what little of the coating they could. Impact! 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 Gonzalez screamed from behind him. Shit, so much for a warning. His group turned and sprinted away from the monsters before diving behind the pre-made berm as fast as they could. As he leaped over the lip of the protrusion, he could already see the blindingly bright flares descending on his position through the perpetual fog. The flares ate at the heavy cloud almost as much as the liquid at their weapons. The flare's path carved a channel through it as the intense heat removed any and all moisture from the air. Get down! Now! He screamed, pushing his team over the edge without care for being gentle. He did not want to be there when those things landed and they were coming in hot. Rough handling was the least of their worries if they were exposed when impact arrived. He had seen what they did to the horrors, and he did not want to experience that firsthand. A flash of white heralded their impact, and a wall of force washed over his prone form, barely broken by the lip he was hiding behind. Their team didn't get much time to lay down before the force rammed into them, pushing them harder into the earth. If it wasn't one thing, it was another. The horrors always came at the worst times and always when they were least expected. Even if he had Halsey scout the entire area, they would still pop up out of nowhere, seemingly stepping out of the fog itself. The team waited for the debris to finish settling before poking out from their hole. Heads popped up like prairie dogs to take in the scene left behind by the flares. It wasn't the first time his team had witnessed the flares in action, but it still left them all speechless for a while after impact. Trees crumbled to dust after the flash conflagration, wind carrying the grainy dust away like black snow in the air. Where the monsters once stood was ground zero for the impact, the soil a glossy black from being glassed. Lone trees stood in a line, blackened and charred, but standing in various spots from the impact. The searing heat diverted by where the horrors stood, the bodies of the monsters shielding them from the worst of it. Report, he called out. All good. Jackson sounded off first. All good. Gonzalez next. Out of mana but good. Halsey came next. Wounded but functional. Larks broke in. I'm fine. Grant's unfamiliar voice broke his rhythm and threw him off for a second. His face twitched at the incorrect response, but he schooled his expression before acting on it. Grant wasn't military and he couldn't treat him as such. Hendricks was lucky to have some of his team with him, even if they had to add a few to it that weren't trained like they had been. They couldn't be picky when they were all fighting for their lives. All right, let's get a move on. We can't stay here, and I want us gone before the harvesters come. Hendricks ordered. He had a unique hatred for those creatures, but an even greater fear of them. They consumed anything and everything with enough mana, and the site they were occupying just became a veritable feast to them. Fire mana saturated the area, mixing and intertwining with the already dense ambient mana in the air. The combination might as well be a giant blinking dinner sign to the creatures further inside the forest. While Hendricks reveled in his new abilities now that the system had come, just as he gained powers, so had others. The artillery team had the highest firepower of anybody he had met, from both the tutorial and after. The power they could unleash was stronger than the shells they launched from before. Rearranging of team members had to be done after returning, but they meshed together well and were able to call down extreme firepower. Not every affinity worked well with such an attack, but the He artillery team was some of the best at it. Every member of the team had either fire, flame, heat, or kinetic affinity they packed into the flares they shot out like one giant ball of fun. Combat engineers constantly worked to improve upon it further, and grand formations were constantly getting updated and reworked for better power transmission. Even though they made new breakthroughs every day, the number of monsters only seemed to climb. They were fighting a losing battle, and with every death, they grew weaker. Hendricks had the same thought as many had in camp. They were in the foothills of Virginia before the system changed everything, and he couldn't help but think other places had to be worse. If it's this bad here, how bad is the rest of the world? Chris. Point of view. The longer I stayed in the city, the more I couldn't shake the feeling it gave off. The arrangement of buildings felt similar, and the way everything was partitioned out felt like I had been here before. It was beginning to mess with my head when I knew a fork in the road would be there before I came upon it. After that, it became clear what I was feeling. Tracy's camp was laid out in the exact same manner. The layout of the roads, the placement of certain buildings were the residential side of the camp. Everything was the same. It seemed Austin had already come to the same conclusion as I turned to see him staring at me, waiting for me to connect the dots. Finally, I realized it almost as soon as we entered. "What took you so long?" he said while thumping me on the shoulder. I had to admit it took me longer than I would have liked. This should have been something I caught as I entered, but it had taken walking through the town for nearly 10 minutes before I got it. "Hey, I spent a lot less time there than you did. I wasn't as familiar with it." I defended myself. That was my excuse, and I was sticking to it. Austin continued to give me shit over it taking so long, but it was all good-natured. The realization led to further thoughts I wasn't sure how to deal with. Finding Tracy wasn't anywhere near anticipated, and I didn't know how to deal with the knowledge that she was here. We hadn't exactly parted on the best terms. While it wasn't the worst, I wasn't sure how our reunion would go. She had said she was from Western Indiana. Why the hell is she in Indianapolis? If I had known that, I might not have made us stop here. It wasn't Christopher. A feminine voice sounded from behind me. A familiar feminine voice. The last voice I had heard before the tutorial ended. I jumped at the sudden appearance and turned to find who I expected. She looked better now than when I had last seen her. Some of the tension was gone, and she didn't seem as strung up. The bags under her eyes were gone along with the slouch in her back. Other than that, she looked the same. She wore the same dull brown leather armor. She styled her hair in the same high ponytail, only coming down further because of the months of growth. Her face looked at me with curiosity instead of the pensiveness I had expected. While I didn't hold anything against her, she might have hard feelings about the way I ended things. It would seem she didn't from her expression. "Ah, Tracy, I didn't expect to see you here," I said sheepishly, like I was caught with my hand in the cookie jar. People talked during the tutorial, and you learned things about them over time. Where you were from, what you did, and things like that were commonly talked about between people inside the camps. Through that, we learned that our tutorial had a wide reach of different places we were taken from. Gabriel described his tutorial as people who were in the area when the integration started, which differed from what we experienced. We had people from all over the US, and some were even from Canada. It was only one group from Canada, and the only reason they got pulled in was because they were in the US when the tutorial started, but still, it counted. They didn't make it long, though. While most ended up dying, I didn't expect to see the people who made it out again. We were all from different parts of the country, and it was rare to run into them again. Needle in a haystack rare. Or that was how it seemed before seeing Tracy standing before me. "Nor did I you. Why are you here? I thought you were going to start a city," she asked bluntly with her arms crossed in front of her. At this point, the initial shock of seeing her again wore off, and I noticed the people around her. All of them were new faces, and they wore decent-looking gear, instead of the ragtag compilation that most walked around in. Identify C. Gave me nothing on their levels, but they looked a step above the rest. That skill was bordering on becoming my most infuriating one as it continued to let me down. Sweeping / C. Still held that title, but Identify C. was coming close if it kept failing to actually work. Seeing the posse she had behind her didn't surprise me. She had always been one to surround herself with others for protection. While I mostly fought alone, she was the opposite. I had yet to see her actually fight now that I thought about it. Her class was all about setting traps before the fight even began. Not that I spent a lot of time at her camp, but I didn't remember anyone telling stories of her fighting either. Without TVs or other entertainment, stories were the main go-to time passer. Tales of a fight you had or a battle you witnessed were traded around between everyone. There were some outlandishly obvious tall tales, but most were rooted in reality enough to understand the underlying story. Austin was the main storyteller I knew, but others would jump into one when the time was right. After moving to Tracy's camp, the stories mixed and we heard of theirs while they heard of ours. Of the ones I could remember, not one was about her fighting on the front lines. They were always of her using a consumable or treasure, or of a trap she had planted. I shook the stray thought from my head to respond to her question. We are just traveling through and thought to stop at the town we came across for supplies. I didn't know you would be here, I replied honestly. She nodded at my response. On your way north, I presume? I nodded in response. It wasn't a secret where we were going, and it wouldn't be hard to figure out. Any in our caravan could answer that question, and I had no intentions to hide my city. It would be a hard thing to do and defeat the purpose of gaining citizens. Guessing where I wished to build my city wasn't hard when she knew my affinity. I hesitated to say any more, though. I was conflicted on how to proceed from where we were. Part of me wouldn't have been surprised if she asked us to leave. Well, why don't you come and have lunch with me? We can talk of your travels and I can tell you of mine. Those were not words I had expected. She didn't wait for my answer before turning and walking toward the stone construction at the center of camp. My mind whirled with the reason she could possibly have to offer that, but it came up with nothing. I was at a loss for her reasoning and I couldn't help but be on the back foot since the beginning. I couldn't get over how she found me. I was only one of the thousands of people walking around the camp. End of chapter 150.